Hello, friends. I am struggling right now with the camera on my tablet, but we're going to try this. Well, good evening and welcome to the Gathering Online. I am Pastor Stephanie, the brand new pastor here at the Gathering at Scott Memorial, and it is my honor to bring the message to you for tonight. So I'll begin with the quote that I started with. This is a quote I found on Facebook that one of my friends posted yesterday. It's from Mitch Albom, who wrote Tuesdays with Morrie and several other well-known books. He said there's a difference between being noticed and being known. And this is something that we struggle with, right? From a young age, we want to notice. We want people to know who we are, but do they really know us? Are we known? Or are we just noticed? And our passage that I'll read for you in just a few minutes comes from the beginning of Exodus, and it's one of my favorite passages ever that I'm excited to share with you. But what does it mean to be known? We live in a world where we want to be noticed, but who knows us? Now, the passage will come from Exodus, but I want to give you a little background on the end of Genesis, how we get to Exodus. So Joseph was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, was one of the favorite sons. And as we learn from this story, it's not a good idea to have a favorite son, especially if the other sons know that that's the case. And unfortunately, Jacob clearly had a favorite son, Joseph and Benjamin as well. And so Jacob had a wonderful coat made for his son Joseph. If you know the Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat story, then that's the story that we're talking about tonight. So it was either a coat made with long sleeves, or so some translations, or the multicolor. Depends on the translation. And the brothers, of course, did not like this. The other 10 did not like that their brother was a favorite. And so some plotted to kill him. And some brothers said, whoa, that seems a bit extreme. So they came up with an alternate plan. While they were out tending the flocks, there happened to be some Ishmaelites going by. And so some brothers said, why don't we just sell him? So they sold their brother Joseph to the Ishmaelites, who then took him to Egypt. They told their father Jacob that Joseph had been killed. So Joseph goes to Egypt, where he is sold to Potiphar. Now, Potiphar's wife happened to really like Joseph and wanted to take advantage of him, and Joseph didn't want that. So then she twisted the story around and landed Joseph in jail. So while Joseph was imprisoned, he was known for interpreting dreams. Several of Pharaoh's high-ups, his baker and his cupbearer, had gotten into trouble with Pharaoh, and they found themselves in prison. And they had these strange dreams. So it turned out that Joseph could interpret the dreams. He felt it was a gift from God that he could do this. So he interpreted the dreams, both of whose dreams came true. Now the cupbearer went back to the Pharaoh, as Joseph said he would. And there he was serving the Pharaoh once again. And so the Pharaoh started having these odd dreams, and no one could interpret them, or at least interpret them to Pharaoh's satisfaction. And the cupbearer happened to remember, oh wow, when I was in prison, there was a man who could interpret the dreams for me. So he had Pharaoh go to the prison, remembered Joseph, and Joseph was taken out and came to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh. Turned out that Pharaoh's dreams meant that there was going to be 7 years of 7 years of plentiful, wonderful bounty, and then 7 years of famine. So they needed to prepare. So Joseph was then put in charge of tending the wheat and all of the goods that they were going to produce, and then be able to distribute them for the 7 years of famine. Now, no one else knew about this. So all the surrounding areas, of course, the 7 years of famine came, were not prepared. And so that is how Jacob decided to send his sons, 10 of his sons, to Egypt to buy food. And it turned out that they happened to be buying food from their own brother Joseph. So that is how the Israelites came to be in Egypt. And as we're told in the beginning of Exodus, a new Pharaoh came into power, and he was very distraught to see how many Israelites there were. And so we're told actually that he sent taskmasters, to oppress them with forced labor, and was ruthless in the task that they opposed upon them. Then the midwives as well were instructed to kill the sons of the Israelites, which thankfully they did not do. And then they were also told to put them in the river Nile, which some families chose to do. And so when Moses, who we find in the book of Exodus, when Moses was born, his mother saw that he was strong after he was 3 months old, put him in the river, but was fairly strategic because the Pharaoh's daughter was just down the river. So the Pharaoh's daughter saw the baby, took Moses out. Moses' sister happened to be right there and then went to get their mother, who nursed him and helped to raise him. And so in Exodus, we find that Moses knows that he's Hebrew, and he happens to see an Egyptian beating an Israelite slave, and he looks around, thinks that no one's there, and kills this Egyptian. However, it was seen. Pharaoh finds out about it, and Pharaoh threatens to kill Moses. So then we come to our passage for today. I'm going to have to put down my tablet, so let's see if I can do this so that I can read from the Bible. Well, you can see the top of my head for a moment. All right, so from the book of Exodus, chapter 2, verses 23 through 3:12. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, the cry for help arose up to God. God heard their groanings, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb and the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burning up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called out to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them out of that land to a good and a broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I, that I should go up to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you, that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. What I love, so when I grew up in a wonderful Methodist church, and I grew up in a church that really taught the New Testament, especially the Gospels. And so I really had this idea that the God of the Old Testament was a wrathful God and totally different from the God of the New Testament. When I was in seminary, this passage really opened up that it's the same God, a God who is merciful, a God who comes down to deliver. And I also wanted to read for you again verse 7, because this was the verse that really stood out to me. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. Now this word in Hebrew, know, is yada. And this word has a special meaning. It doesn't mean just to know intellectually, but it means to experience. It's deeper than empathy and sympathy. Yada means to experience it with us. I found this awesome resource that I want to share with you all from TorahResource.com, which explains how the concept of knowing something or someone takes on a special meaning in the Semitic languages. And the specialized meaning has to do with relationship, primarily a relationship that is based on the making of a covenant. Moreover, in the scriptures, there's a difference between knowing someone and knowing something. To know something means to understand it, to be aware of it, to be able to explain it to someone else. In other words, to know something means to have an intellectual understanding of something. But more often than not, in the Semitic cultures, and languages. To know someone means to have a relationship with that person, and very often to have a covenant relationship with someone. In fact, this word yada is used in the Old Testament to signify a marriage covenant. So yada is the most intimately we can know someone. This is the word, though, that God chooses to use. I know their sufferings. I have seen their cries on account of their taskmasters. God says, I know them. I experience it with them. And God is also claiming the Israelites as God's people. Now, of course, this is not the only place where we see God saying they know them. In Psalm 139, we find this word again, as God says, the psalmist says, "O Lord, you have searched me and know me. You know when I sit up and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down. You are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely." And then in verse 13, we find, "For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb." It's God who knew that we were to be before our mothers even knew that they were pregnant with us. God was knitting us together in our mother's wombs. God knows everything about us when we sit down, when we rise up, even our thoughts before we think them. And then Jesus touches on this as well in Luke 12, verse 7, "For even the hairs on your head are counted." So I've been blessed from my parents of having thick hair. And so God even knows before I do that I'm losing hair. I'm always shedding. So God knows the count even before I do. Before I even know I've lost a hair and I have no idea how many hairs on my head, God knows this. Now, God wants to have this kind of intimate relationship with us, to know each one of us, to know our sufferings, to know our joys. God wants to feel all of us with us, and God desires a relationship where we tell God everything. God knows our problems before we even bring them to God, yet God still wants us to bring them. God already knows the solution, yet God still wants that intimate relationship where we bring them to God. Because we know that God is in control and we trust God. Going back to that Mitch Albom quote that I shared at the beginning, God doesn't just notice us, but God knows us. God knows our struggles. God knows everything about us. God wants us to care as deeply for others as God cares for us. Now, to tell you kind of the cliff notes of the end of the Exodus story, God does deliver the Israelites from the hands of the Egyptians. That's where we get the wonderful Passover. Then God is with them in the wilderness. God parts the seas so they can flee safely from the Egyptians. And then God provides manna from heaven and then water from a rock. God is with the people for 40 years, taking them to that good and broad land, that land flowing of milk and honey. And God is there as a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire during the night. God is there with them. And then Jesus tells us, especially in Mark 12, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And the truth is, we do not love God, we do not love ourselves, we do not love our neighbors if we do not know them. That is a key part of love, is knowing. Now I have a confession for you, church. I struggle with Facebook. I'm fully aware, by the way, that I'm making this confession on Facebook, which just makes it even funnier in my life. Now, I must recognize Facebook is neutral. Facebook is not good or bad. Facebook is just a tool, and sometimes I use it negatively in my life. I've actually had to delete it from my phone, the app, because it was the first thing I would look at when I woke up and the last thing before I went to bed. And sometimes it put me in a bad mood. It helped to make my mood not be good because I'd see how people would treat others. I'd see things that were going on in the world that just broke my heart. And I was like, this is not good for my spiritual life. So I had to put my own restrictions. I struggle with the sin of coveting and envy, and Facebook was really aiding me as I would see the great things going on in other people's lives I have a good life. I have a great life, awesome life. But there are things that I wanted that Facebook will kind of show me. And so I had to put up kind of restrictions because Facebook was keeping me how I was using it. Facebook was keeping me from fully loving my neighbors because I didn't want to know them. I barely wanted to notice them. And so sometimes I have to put up those restrictions when I know I'm not doing so well with that. So if you need to contact me, I realize that Facebook is great for pastoral needs. Facebook Messenger I do have on my phone, so you can always contact me that way. And I try to get on a couple times a week on Facebook so that I kind of know what's going on. So please forgive me if I don't see right away the things going on in your life. Please have somebody let me know. Now, God wants us to live into that greatest commandment, to know God, to know neighbor, and to know ourselves. And we know God when we're in constant relationship, when we're praying to God, when we're reading the scriptures, when we're involved in worship, when we're discussing God with one another. That's how we help to know God. Then we know our neighbors when we actually get to know them, when we know their names, when we find out their struggles, when we know what's really going on in their lives. And then we also know ourselves. God has given us the wonderful gift of our bodies. Our bodies help us to tell us what's going on in our bodies. So as I shared earlier today, I served as a young adult missionary for 2 years in Los Angeles, California, and being originally from the East Coast, it was a totally different world for this East Coaster to go to California, and I felt homesick. And so any time that I was craving grilled cheese sandwiches, I began to learn that that was usually a sign that I was missing home. And so I needed to take care of myself a little more, take Sabbath time, reconnect with friends, do things to help take care of my body. And then I also realized that sometimes pain, right? Sometimes our bodies give us a signal, of pain to tell us when we need to stop doing things. And then our guts also tell us things. My gut tells me when I need to eat more vegetables, when I've not been eating healthy. My stomach's pretty good at letting me know. Our bodies are made to tell us things if we just stop and listen. Our mission statement at the gathering is to reconnect with God, others, ourselves, and creation. And we do this when we know, when we yada, God, ourselves, others, and creation. This week, I encourage us to take an honest look at our relationship with God, ourselves, and our neighbors. Do we just notice them, or do we actually know them? This week, I was honored to take part in our mission trip. I'm wearing this shirt, but I realize you probably can't see it. But I went with the youth to the filling station down in New Bern. It was a converted filling station for propane that now is a food pantry. And so it's the middle schoolers are the ones who did that. They got to connect with the clients, but also the wonderful volunteers. They also reconnected in creation when they were helping the garden at Miss Rachel's house. Miss Rachel had just lost her son last week. And so they heard about her grief. They heard stories about her son, how she's doing, and just got to know her. The high schoolers worked with Sherry and Eric. Their house was affected by Hurricane Florence, not by the floods, but the hurricane came and took off part of their roof, those crazy winds. And so the flooding for them came from the sky, came from above, as they lost so much. And so for several months, probably 8 or 9 months, they've been living in this crazy mold. They actually have a camper, so thankfully weren't living totally in it. But Sherry had a really hard time letting go of stuff. And so they listened as she shared the story of each item in her home, as she had to discern, do I give this up? Is it salvageable, or is it time to say goodbye to this? And they really got to know her. And they really modeled what it means to know our neighbors. So that's really our question. How are we doing? Do we know God? Do we know God as intimately as we should, as God knows us? Do we know our neighbors? Do we really know what's going on with them? And do we know ourselves? Are we listening to our bodies when our bodies are telling us we need to do different things? And are we listening to creation? What is creation telling us as well? So I encourage you this week to do that. Robbie told me that usually Pastor Rachel would send out kind of some sermon notes. So I'm going to be working on that this week. So stay tuned to your email for that. I totally forgot about announcements. And I think there is a Parents Night Out coming up. I want to say July 12th. However, check your email in case my memory's not serving me correctly. And also a Meals on Wheels opportunity. All right, the gathering. It's Memorial Family. I will see you all later. Have a wonderful night.